Volodymyr Zelensky is in big trouble. And when I say Volodymyr Zelensky, I don't just mean Zelensky himself, but the entire Ukraine proxy war that is led by, provoked by, and of course fueled by NATO. Volodymyr Zelensky came to Washington, D.C., first made a stop to New York City for the UN General Assembly the week of the 18th of September. And uh, again, the UN General Assembly and the United Nations as a whole was hijacked by the Ukraine situation, the Ukraine proxy war, unsurprising. But unlike in past instances where Zelensky made a trip to Washington, for example, or to the United States to meet with Biden or to the UN, this time around, Ukraine is in a much different situation. Unlike a year ago, or even more than a year ago, a year and a half or so ago, Ukraine is no longer in the driver's seat in terms of the narrative. The collective West has fueled and armed to the teeth Ukraine 3 different times. We're talking about 3 different militaries have been supplied up until this point in the conflicts. It's February 2022, and all of them have been decimated by Russia. Now, the latest situation is this counteroffensive, which is indeed a failure. More than 60,000, almost 70,000 people, Ukrainian forces killed in action, meaning they are dead, they are gone, a massive amount in just about 3 months. Also, much of NATO's weaponry that was supplied to Ukraine has been destroyed. And now the United States is facing a very unstable political situation. The United States being the albatross, the head of NATO, and of course, the head of this proxy war. And that political situation runs the risk of destroying the very basis for this proxy war, which is the constant supply of weaponry and aid to Ukraine. So now the mood has cooled. The neocons across the political aisle in Washington are no longer as enthusiastic as they once were. You have seen on this program many different analysts come as guests, as well as myself, talk about how the mainstream Western corporate media, from the New York Times, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, you can go on and on and on. Just read what they are all saying. They're all talking about a long war, a war of attrition, how this conflict is now not going to be resolved by any kind of Ukrainian offensive, but by a long-term push against Russia that could be in the amount of years. Now, Ukraine doesn't have years, and it never had years if this counteroffensive is any kind of measure. But that, of course, was never the point. The point was that Ukraine was supposed to win. They were supposed to succeed, and Zelensky was supposed to be the puppet that made the United States and NATO look good on the world stage again, and that was supposed to stick a thumb in the Russian bear's eyes and destroy what has become a thorn in the side of the collective West, which is a more powerful, more independent, and more sovereign Russia. None of that has occurred, and none of that will occur. And now the tune has changed, and it's even worse than what I had just described. It's worse than just talking about a war of attrition, a long war, etc. Now they're talking about this visit by Zelensky as being essentially a completely different kind of venture. And I'm going to show you why. So the collective West, and I'm going to show you first, actually, how Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, so this is really important. Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, he has been probably the most vocal against Ukraine aid within the neocon foreign policy establishment. And mind you, everyone at this level politically in the United States and Washington is a neocon. Nonetheless, the words are beginning to matter. And Zelensky came to Washington on September 21st, Thursday, where he was introduced, or he was coming off the heels of a flurry of news stories talking about how this time it's going to be different. And look at here, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy demands accountability from Zelensky. This is a lot different from his current Congress visit and the reception he received from Nancy Pelosi when she was Speaker of the House. He wants to check or to talk to the Ukrainian president before writing another check to Kiev. So U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy refused to commit another $24 billion to Ukraine, telling reporters that he has some questions for Volodymyr Zelensky first. While the existing budget for Kiev is drying up, disagreement on authorizing another funding package threatens to grind Washington to a halt. And mind you, this is par for the course for domestic Washington politics. There's always the possibility of a so-called government freeze, shutdown, and it usually is over budgetary concerns in which political party is trying to withhold some kind of money. Usually it's for social programs, but this time it's to a conflict that doesn't have any kind of off switch for the spigot. So Zelensky is due to meet lawmakers on Capitol Hill during a visit on Washington this Thursday. Ahead of the meeting, McCarthy was asked on Tuesday whether he would pledge the $124 billion in military and economic aid to the Ukrainian president, as Joe Biden requested. Is Zelensky elected to Congress? McCarthy responded. Is he our president? I don't think I have to commit anything, and I think I have questions for him. Where is the accountability on the money we've already spent? What is the plan for victory? I think that's what the American public wants to know. So this is important because right after this story broke, here is Axios. When Zelensky finally arrived to Washington and attempted to meet with Congress, McCarthy wouldn't allow an address. So I think you remember when Zelensky visited in 2022, when he visited during Nancy Pelosi's reign as Speaker of the House, he received a warm reception across the political aisle, claps, the flag. He came in his war fatigues, and there was no challenge. Now, we fast forward to today, and it's a lot different. McCarthy wouldn't let Zelensky joint address the Congress during his D.C. visit. Why does it matter? Zelensky asked for a joint session, and we just didn't have time. He's already given a joint session, said McCarthy on Thursday. Zelensky last visited Washington last December to meet with President Biden, hold a press conference at the White House, and hold a joint session of Congress. That happened last December before things started to go awry. So, of course, the Western mainstream media has been talking about this moment for quite some time as it has built up. And here is an Indian publication, the Hindu Business Line, saying for Zelensky, this Washington visit is different. The support for Ukraine in Washington seems to be weakening. Biden is also weighed down by domestic issues. It is now slowly becoming official that after an in-person appearance at the UN Assembly to lobby world leaders for more support for Ukraine, which we're going to get to, I'm going to show you the foolishness of what that was, how Zelensky behaved, which plays into why the neocons are starting to slowly but surely withdraw its support for Zelensky's antics. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will be on his way to D.C., so he's going to visit. And at a recent meeting with Zelensky in Kiev, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken assured the Ukrainian leader that Washington is determined to continue to walk side by side with Ukraine. There are at least three aspects to a changed Washington that Zelensky must be aware of. First, the U.S. is not fully sold on the Ukrainian counteroffensive claims of the last several weeks, with apprehension on the extent of the recapture of Zelensky's forces. Also, Moscow has not been taken kindly to a U.S. decision to supply cluster munitions that have been banned by many countries, and more recently on providing armor-piercing depleted uranium anti-tank rounds for M1 Abrams tank. Russians called it a criminal act. The U.S. decision in Europe to provide new weaponry, including F-16 jets, has not gone unnoticed by the Kremlin. With Russia nowhere near losing the war, showing signs of exhaustion, the perception is one of Putin playing it out for as long as possible, pinning his hopes on the West, eventually losing a war of nerves. And this is causing within Washington consternation because they underestimated Russia. How many times have we said that on this program? Underestimating Russia was always going to be a folly. And look at what's happening. Putin, Russia, they're willing. Right? Russia is willing to, the war of attrition was Russia's strategy, not Ukraine's. The fact that they're trying to shift the narrative means that there's big trouble and it's starting to have consequences. So now the environment at Capitol Hill has to worry Zelensky, and we just saw the results of that. Ukrainian leader is visiting at a time when some U.S. lawmakers are clearly exhibiting signs of exasperation, issuing blank checks, especially when at loggerheads over spending for domestic programs. It is not just hardline Trump Republicans getting uneasy over the Ukraine spending. There are some murmurs within the Democratic Party as well. And so we're talking about the Biden administration of already having provided 76.8 billion in assistance to Ukraine, with military aid alone accounting for nearly 50 billion at 46.6 billion. Now, Congress is debating an additional 24 billion in military and humanitarian assistance, and Kevin McCarthy is looking at the prospect of separating Ukraine assistance from the federal package to avert a shutdown on September 30th. And now, thirdly, he's coming to Washington at the time, or he came to Washington when impeachment of President Biden is perking up, with lawmakers hanging on the coattails of a former president determined to drag the Democratic president through a vexing process that Democrats made President Trump endure not once, but twice. And this is in reference to also Hunter Biden's indictment for all of the various crimes that he has committed. So that was a Hindu business line setting up somewhat of the environment. And all of those factors are very relevant. The domestic political situation in Washington is deteriorating, and the battlefield situation and the prospects for Ukrainian victory have all but gone up in smoke. There is no way this counteroffensive achieves anything except more losses on the side of Ukraine, and of course, more losses for NATO, particularly the United States, when it comes to where this aid is going. And you've seen, and I've covered this to some extent on this program, we've seen the carousel and the merry-go-round within Kiev's political administration now. We had Reznikov have to resign, the defense minister, then the deputy defense ministers. I believe there are 6 of them had to resign. And of course, there was that Ukrainian armed forces spokesperson, the trans-American, very odd situation there. But nonetheless, she was kicked on her can because of threats she made to journalists that really did smear and I think put a bad taste in the United States' mouth when they're trying to tell Kiev to cool it. Here she is saying, we're going to hunt down Russians and independent journalists and anyone we don't like who says anything about the war we don't like. Doesn't look too good. So with that said, the Hill also had warnings for Zelensky as he came in. As GOP skepticism grows, Zelensky faces a tough task. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will travel to Washington. So he traveled to Washington on Thursday when support is waning from the Republicans. The Capitol Hill are going to battle over how to avoid a government shutdown, and this is going to have implications for Ukraine. So those are the issues. But now the question is, and this is what is so interesting about Volodymyr Zelensky, the question is, how will Zelensky approach this? Will he be more careful, more tactful? Will he begin to play the role he was always supposed to play, which was puppet? He was always supposed to be a puppet. He was supposed to do whatever the United States and NATO said, say yes when asked any questions, say no when he's supposed to say no, say yes when he's supposed to say yes. Zelensky has not done any of that. And now the Washington Post, and here's an interesting piece. The Washington Post said, Washington, don't even try to tell Zelensky to compromise. So here you have the neocons, all of them, from Blinken to Biden, now McCarthy, all of these forces in some form or version, whether it's whispering in the background, backdoor meetings, back channel meetings, and Kevin McCarthy, of course, more publicly for political reasons, making this an issue. They're all saying this needs to cool down. Maybe this needs to freeze. Maybe aid needs to be reduced. Maybe it needs to be held off. Something needs to change. Well, here you have the Washington Post saying, don't even try telling Zelensky to compromise. If anyone on Capitol Hill and the White House thinks Ukrainian President Zelensky, when he visits Washington, can be talked into ultimately accepting anything less than the ejection of Russian forces from his country, forget it. The Ukrainian people, despite the depredations they have endured over the last 19 months, are adamant in their determination to oust the invaders. A negotiated settlement or ceasefire is simply unthinkable. That was my overwhelming sense, gleaned from talking with a broad swath of Ukrainians during a week-long visit. So this is the narrative of those who want to keep the war going. That this columnist, he said he went to the Ukraine. He talked about all the horrors. I'm not going to get into the article because it really isn't too interesting. It is simply just, right? Is really democracy dying in darkness? That's what the Washington Post is. So that's the argument that's being made. But, well, of course, this argument of, well, Washington shouldn't even ask because there's so much moral superiority on the Ukraine side, despite, of course, all those SS symbols and all those Azov, Neo, NAZIs, despite all of that, there's some moral high ground here that Ukraine is liberating itself from some kind of invader. Regardless of the errors of that argument, there is a truth to that headline that I think is not being talked about. That headline could also read, in terms of the content afterward, as a fact. And why is it a fact? It's because Zelensky himself has operated and acted in a way where his entire existence hinges upon this conflict maintaining some kind of made up moral superiority, a public relations stunt that positions himself as a powerful so-called democratic actor being led around by his democratic masters, that in a crusade against the so-called aggressor Russia. Without that, Zelensky is nothing. So Zelensky has been put in a very interesting position. On the one hand, he's supposed to do whatever his NATO masters, whatever the United States says, the neocons, whatever they say he's supposed to do. But on the other hand, if they want to cool things down, he can't afford for that to happen because his entire existence is predicated upon it. There is no possibility of Zelensky maintaining any kind of semblance of leadership in Ukraine or anywhere else. He'll be on a jet somewhere else if the conflict were to be frozen. He needs the conflict. He needs this war to go on. He needs Ukrainian armed forces and the tens of thousands to die on the front lines if he is going to survive politically. So that could indeed be how that headline could be explained. It's not all of this stuff that the Washington Post is trying to sell you. It's the fact that Zelensky indeed does need this war, and without it, he is nothing. And because of that, there's going to be no compromise from the Ukraine side. And we already know Russia's position is that Russia says, we're going to determine the outcome of this conflict. We're not going to get into some kind of Minsk 3.0 again. But now I want to talk to you about how this was all confirmed. Zelensky's behavior. You would think the neocons are telling him. Blinken has told him. You hear Mark Milley. You hear Kevin McCarthy. All these neocon foreign policy establishment forces and of course, their handlers, those who do their bidding in Washington, they're all saying something kind of similar here. They're saying, cool it, freeze it. Let's move a little slower. We'll continue to support you for as long as it takes, but it's going to be as long as it takes. Not, you lost the offensive, that's it. Now we've got to do some damage control. Did Zelensky act like that at the UN General Assembly when he went before his visit to Washington? Absolutely not. And let me show you just how foolish Zelensky acted, which just puts more, I think, it fans the flames. It really does add more fuel to the fire that is Zelensky being a liability for the collective West. So here is Zelensky. He was supposed to meet with Brazilian President Lula da Silva. And remember, at the G7 summit, where Lula also attended, even though Brazil is not a G7 member, but there are other leaders there, Zelensky was supposed to meet with Lula then. And what did he do? He ghosted Lula da Silva. Now, look at how Zelensky treats Lula da Silva, and they were supposed to meet again. It got canceled, and here's why. Look at this. Look at how Volodymyr Zelensky does not clap. Everyone else is clapping. It's a packed room. People are being respectful and courteous, and Zelensky is making a scene, not clapping for Lula da Silva. Here we go. Making a scene as Lula is speaking. And there you have again, there's the clapping, and there you have Zelensky pouting in the corner. So this did not go. This was not taken very well by Lula da Silva. The meeting at the UN General Assembly on the sidelines was canceled. Lula da Silva said, no, we're not going to be treated like that, and allow such a meeting to occur. Now I'm going to pull up what Zelensky said at the UN, which just underscores how Zelensky will never give up his vice grip over the narrative of this conflict, regardless of how much it's needed, how much the collective West and the neocons are telling him, stop it. You need to tone it down and start to play your cards right. And here's Che Bose over, I believe he's a journalist at RT. Here is him posting about some of the remarks, the highlights from Zelensky. Here we go.
Каждое десятилетие Россия начинает новую войну. Части Молдовы и Грузии остаются оккупированными. Россия превратилась...
Every decade, Russia starts a new war, says Zelensky. Of course, his NATO masters, the United States at the head, how many wars have they waged over the last couple decades? It's quite a lot. And if we include proxy wars, it's double figures. Here we go.
Сирию в руины. И если бы...
Right. This again, Syria was turned to ruins by Russia, not the US, NATO-backed, Israeli-backed forces, proxy forces, armed groups, jihadists that invaded the country on behalf of the collective West. No, not them. This is a puppet out of control.
Это не Россия. Химическое оружие никогда бы не было использовано в Сирии. Россия...
That's Dmitry Polanski. He is an ambassador. He's a Russian ambassador to the UN. That is classic. No one cares what Zelensky is saying, especially the Russian side.
Почти проглотила Белоруссию. Она явно угрожает Казахстану и Балтийским государствам.
So this is Zelensky. That was Zelensky showing who he is. He is just completely and rabidly, not just anti-Russia, but he is willing to promote the most egregious lies. He's willing to put Russia over what NATO and the United States has done, just stamp it with Russia in order to prove the worth of his, not even his lost cause, but the lost cause of his NATO masters. And that kind of behavior is exactly why it's this kind of behavior that makes the collective West more and more suspicious of Zelensky, that he's willing to try to almost play this world leader, world hero. That's not going to work when you're losing. And here he is again. This was probably the most disgusting thing that he said at the United Nations General Assembly. This is now on the United Nations Security Council, which he got a chance to speak. And mind you, Sergei Lavrov was in the room, but Zelensky spoke first, and then Zelensky and the Ukraine side, they left the room before Lavrov had a chance to give his remarks with Zelensky present. So they didn't have the confrontation everyone was hoping they would have. But here you have Ukrainian soldiers are now doing in their blood what the UN Security Council should do with their votes, stopping aggression, defending the principles of the UN Charter. So this is someone who's literally sending Ukrainians to die in the tens of thousands in a failed counteroffensive, which is being fueled by the United States and NATO and has no reason to continue or to even have happened in the first place. And of course, we can go over the history where Zelensky and the United States and the UK tore up a peace agreement in April 2022. We can go all the way back then. All of this, right? All of this is being justified by Ukrainian blood. I don't know if there's anything more egregiously despicable than that, but here is him saying it.
Українські солдати зараз своєю кров'ю роблять те, що Рада безпеки ООН має робити своїми голосуваннями.
All right, so there's no subtitles to that, but that's the translation. Essentially, what is he saying? He is telling the world, he's telling the UN Security Council that they need to do with their votes what Ukrainians are doing with their blood, using the deaths of Ukrainians to justify his and of course, what really is his masters, his NATO masters, his neocon masters, to justify their failed project. But lastly, now I want to show you, and we're going to go back to our friend Che Bose again, because this is how pathetic it has gotten. It's all theatric, it's all political theater, and we know that Zelensky is well trained in theater. He's huge in the entertainment industry before becoming a politician. All of his biggest backers, his biggest billionaire backers, that's how they helped him get a career, and then that's who propelled him into the halls of power in Ukraine to take part in the coup government there. And here's Che Bose showing you how Ukrainian media spun this whole, and this is probably the most disgusting of the of all of this, is Ukrainian TV edited a video of the hall to show Zelensky, even though this is not even disgusting, this is more just funny. They edited, and here's the full tweet, his UN General Assembly speech so that it looked like the crowd was more numerous than it really was bigger than it really was. But in doing so, they showed Zelensky listening to Zelensky. So here's Zelensky speaking. All right, here's the video. Zelensky is speaking, and you'll see Zelensky watching Zelensky speak. Here we go.
Не розгортати цю зброю, не розповсюджувати, не допускати погрози нею, не допускати тренування для того, щоб забезпечити ядерне роззброєння. І це хороша стратегія. Але вона не
There he is. Zelensky is watching himself speak at the UN General Assembly. There he is. You can see with my I think you can see my error on the screen, I believe. There he is. Maybe you can't. But there he is. Zelensky is watching Zelensky speak. I mean, it's piss poor editing. It's the worst editing. I mean, I'm not a video editor. I can't really edit for anything, but I know people who help me sometimes edit, and this is just bad.
не повинна бути єдиною стратегією для того, щоб
Anyway, so we don't need to listen to the rest of him talking. But the point is, what is the point? Well, the point is that Ukrainian TV, and this is the narrative management, this is the problem with Zelensky, this is the problem with his regime, is that they rely on lies to justify what now is a failed project. And even when the neocons are saying, Zelensky, we got to cool it, you got to stop this corruption, you got to clean up, get rid of these guys, you might be one of those guys that needs to be getting rid of. But until then, and until we can stabilize things, you need to be the stable one. You need to look like you are playing the part you were hired to play. You're supposed to be the hero. You're supposed to be the so-called Democrat against the aggressor, against the authoritarian, the autocrat. You're supposed to be the hero of this story, and really you're just the zero of this story now. And it's making the United States and the rest of the collective West look terrible, because the United States and the collective West have actually sacrificed quite a lot. The U.S. a lot less, because what did the U.S. do? It went off the backs of Europe. It used Europe as a cudgel and as a kind of springboard for the United States to maintain a semblance of stability in this time. But the economic situation in the United States is not favorable. There is a huge polarization going on. Kevin McCarthy's comments, his rejection of Zelensky this time around, is also its kind of political theater, but it's political theater that matters in the sense that it sets the terrain up for what is to come for Ukraine, which is the neocon foreign policy establishment is saying in Zelensky's ear, in the Ukrainian regime's ear. They're saying this needs to cool down, this needs to slow down, this is going to be a years-long venture, and it's not going to look like the conflict that we had dreamt of. We dreamt of a conflict that would take Russia down. The sanctions would take Russia down. The front line would bog Russia down. We would get Russia's Vietnam, like the Soviet Union got its Vietnam and Afghanistan, and Russia would crumble. None of that has occurred. None of that will occur. And the collective West is starting to lick its chops, and it's starting to come to some semblance of reality. So now there's a debate. Now there is conversation, there's real conversation about whether aid should continue. And that means if aid is to continue, which Blinken and these neocon forces, Newland, Sullivan, Biden, the Democrats, much of the Republicans, the Millies of the world, they all want aid to continue. The military contractors want aid to continue, but they can't justify it if Zelensky acts like a big baby, like a like a spoiled brat. Like, essentially, Zelensky is a spoiled actor, as Alex Christoforou from the Duran said on this program, and that's what he is. But when you act like that, it makes the masters look bad. It makes those who are actually setting the terrain, who are actually shaping the political and military environment, NATO, the collective West, at least on the side of Ukraine, it makes them look bad. And it makes Russia look better. And Russia has gained a lot diplomatically. It has gained a lot economically. Russia is going to grow 2% plus, more than all of Europe and slightly higher than the United States. So Russia is stabilizing. Russia is looking better. The world is not isolating Russia. The United States and the collective West is isolating themselves. And Ukraine and Zelensky is not helping. So his visit to Washington was a dud. Whether the $24 billion is agreed upon or not, that really is neither here nor there, because the situation on the battlefield is not good. It is unfavorable. It's not working out. And with that, well, comes the hard truth that Zelensky is going to get cut off from the neocons one way or the other, whether it's now or whether it is slightly later or whether it's somewhere in the future. But the path has been laid. The counteroffensive was a failure. This is now a war of attrition, which can only favor Russia. And Ukraine is, in fact, doomed. The only hope that Ukraine has is some kind of peaceful settlement, which will be resolved and done and led on Russia's terms. And so now it's a matter of, will the neocons finally cave to the pressure, or will they continue their suicide mission? My bets are they'll continue their suicide mission, but it's going to look a whole lot different, and Zelensky is by no means safe. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.